He looks like he's used to coach anyway. Those 7 words spoken with the casual cruelty of someone who had never once been made to feel small landed in the first-class cabin of Flight 882, like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples they created would keep spreading long after the plane never left the ground. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before the words there was the bag, and before the bag there was a man who had spent 44 years learning how to stand in spaces where people like Patricia Weston had already decided he didn't belong, and learning how to stand there without flinching, without shrinking, without giving them the satisfaction of watching him become smaller so they could feel larger. Damian Cole stepped into the first-class cabin of Terminal 4's Flight 882 at 7:42 in the evening, a bespoke charcoal suit absorbing the soft overhead lighting. His broad shoulders carrying the particular kind of stillness that comes not from ease but from discipline, from years of choosing composure over explosion. And what he saw when he reached row 1 stopped him cold. Seat 1. His seat, the seat he had booked 3 weeks ago, the seat that corresponded exactly to the boarding pass in his left hand, was occupied. Not by a person, by a bag. A bright orange Hermes Birkin bag, $4,000 worth of structured leather and brass hardware sitting in the center of the plush first-class seat like it had paid full fare and expected the meal service. While the woman in 1B scrolled through Instagram without a single glance upward, her platinum blonde hair lacquered into a helmet that didn't move when she tilted her head, her heels already kicked off onto the floor, her entire body arranged in the posture of someone who had long ago decided that the world existed primarily to accommodate her. Damian took one quiet breath and stepped forward. The day had started the way most of Damian Cole's days started lately, which was to say it had started before the sun did in the particular darkness of a man who had too much to carry and not quite enough hours to carry it in. JFK. Terminal 4640 in the morning. The July heat already pressing its humid hands against the glass doors even before they slid open, and Damian moved through security with the practiced efficiency of someone who had memorized the choreography of airports, the way other people memorize highways between their house and their office, which is to say, completely automatically without having to think about it at all. He was 44 years old, and he had built Cole Global Logistics from a single rented office in Baltimore with second-hand furniture and a laptop that overheated if you ran too many spreadsheets simultaneously, and he had built it not through inheritance or connection, or the kind of quiet advantage that some people carry through their lives like a tailwind they've stopped noticing, but through the particular stubbornness of a man who had been told in 100 different ways in 100 different rooms that the seat at the table was already taken, and who had responded each time by pulling up a chair anyway. Cole Global had just, and this detail matters. This detail is the thing that would make everything that happened next feel like the universe operating with a very specific and ironic kind of precision. Secured the exclusive contract to restructure the supply chains for 3 of North America's largest commercial airlines. A deal worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $800 million over 5 years, a deal that had not yet been announced to the public that existed right now only in the knowledge of a very small number of very senior people, and that required Damian to be in London in 9 hours, to sit across a table and shake hands with the investors who would make it official. He was not supposed to be famous today. He was supposed to be tired and quiet and invisible, sliding through the airport the way wealthy people who have learned the value of anonymity tend to do. And when Chloe at the first-class check-in counter looked up from her screen and recognized his name, and her voice dropped instinctively to the particular register people use when they're trying not to make a scene of the fact that they've just recognized someone important, Damian had responded with a warm and genuine smile and asked about her evening and thanked her by name when she handed back his documents. He bypassed the lounge. He didn't want champagne or the low murmur of business conversations happening at other tables. He wanted seat 1A and approximately 6 hours of unconsciousness before London, and as he walked down the jet bridge and stepped into the cool, recycled air of the aircraft with his briefcase in his right hand and his boarding pass in his left, he had every reasonable expectation that this was exactly what he was going to get. He was, of course, very wrong. Patricia Weston had boarded 12 minutes before Damien, which was enough time to fully colonize the territory around seats 1A and 1B, in the way that some people colonize space not out of necessity, but out of an unexamined conviction that their comfort is simply more important than other people's inconvenience. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, dressed in a cream-colored pantsuit that had been expensive when it was purchased and now fit slightly too tightly across the shoulders, in a way that suggested either the suit had changed or she had. And her platinum blonde hair was set into a rigid, lacquered structure that seemed to operate independently of wind gravity or the general laws of physics that applied to everyone else's hair on the plane. She had handed her boarding pass to Andre, the cabin's purser, by pushing it against his chest without looking at his face, and she had requested help with her overhead luggage in the tone of someone placing a room service order. And when Andre had lifted her heavy rolling case into the bin with a visible effort that would have prompted most people to at least acknowledge the assistance with a nod. Patricia had already turned away and was lowering herself into seat 1B with the satisfaction of a woman who considered this kind of service her natural due. Her shoes came off immediately. Her tote bags were arranged around her. Her phone came out. And the Birkin bag, the orange one, the $4,000 one. The one that had its own opinions about where it wanted to sit was lifted from her arm and placed directly in the center of seat 1. With the careful deliberateness of someone settling a child into a preferred spot. 3 rows back, in seat 4, a 9-year-old boy named Noah watched all of this with the calm, unblinking attention of a child who is still at the age where the world is genuinely interesting and has not yet learned to pretend otherwise. He was traveling with his grandmother, Mrs. Ida Grant, a retired schoolteacher from Philadelphia, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and carried butterscotch candies in her cardigan pocket, and Noah had his small sketchbook open on his tray table and a pencil in his hand, and he was looking at the orange bag on seat 1A, with the particular expression children get when they've noticed something that doesn't quite make sense to them, and they're deciding whether or not to ask about it. He decided to wait and see. Damien stopped at row. One looked at his boarding pass, looked at the bag, looked at the woman in 1B, and said in the most reasonable tone a person can use when they've just discovered that someone has put their designer luggage in the seat that corresponds to the boarding pass in their hand. "Excuse me." Patricia did not look up. Her thumb continued its slow scroll through what appeared to be a feed of interior design photographs, a series of marble countertops and open-plan kitchens that had apparently reached a critical stage requiring her full attention. Damien cleared his throat, a small deliberate sound that in the quiet of a boarding cabin tends to carry, and said again a fraction louder, "Excuse me, ma'am, I believe you have your bag in my seat." This time Patricia looked up, and the look she gave him was one of those looks that manages to convey an entire hierarchy of assumptions in the time it takes for eyes to travel from a person's shoes to their face and back again. A look that registered his presence, the way you might register a piece of furniture that has been moved into an inconvenient position, and said with a sigh that seemed to contain the full weight of her inconvenience at having been interrupted. "What your bag is in seat 1. Damien said. "That's my seat. I need you to move it." Patricia looked at the bag. She looked at Damien. She looked at the bag again as though conducting a careful comparison, and when she looked back at him, her expression had settled into something that was not quite contempt, but was practicing to become it. "This is a $4,000 bag," she said, as though this were a complete and sufficient answer to his request, as though the monetary value of the leather rendered the argument automatically resolved in her favor. "I'm not putting it on the floor. The leather stains. I understand it's valuable. Damien said, his voice maintaining the particular measured patience of a man who has had a great deal of practice remaining calm in situations where other people have decided his needs are optional. But I have a ticket for this seat. I need to sit down. Patricia tilted her head and looked at him the way people look at something that has appeared in the wrong place and needs to be redirected, and she said, "There are seats in the back. Economy has plenty of room, and honestly," and here she paused and her eyes moved over him with a deliberateness that made the next words not just an observation, but a verdict. "He looks like he's used to coach anyway." The cabin went very quiet. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't arrive all at once, but moves through a space like a temperature drop, person by person, row by row. The young couple in row 2 stopping mid-conversation. The businessman in row 3, lowering his newspaper without fully realizing he was doing it. The flight attendant 2 rows back pausing with a drink in each hand. In row 4, Noah looked up from his sketchbook and turned to his grandmother with the earnest confusion of a child who has heard something that doesn't compute, and whispered, "Grandma, why does the man have to go to the back? He has a ticket. I can see his ticket from here." And Mrs. Ida Grant, who had spent 32 years teaching 4th grade and had heard a great many things she couldn't explain to children, in simple terms looked at her grandson and said quietly, "I know, baby. Keep watching." And there was something in her voice that was not quite sadness and not quite anger, but was made up of both of those things and something older than either of them. Andre appeared at Damien's elbow, smooth and professional, the way good cabin crew appear when they sense a situation developing, and he looked at the boarding passes, Damien's and the imaginary one the bag might have held, and said with careful politeness, "Mrs. Weston, Mr. Cole is correctly assigned to seat 1A. I'm going to need you to move your bag to the overhead bin or under the seat in front of you." Patricia's chin lifted approximately 1 inch, which was her way of indicating that she had heard this information and had chosen to regard it as optional, and she said, "I want to speak to your supervisor. My husband knows the CEO of this airline personally, and I am not putting my property on a dirty floor because some," and she stopped there as though she'd caught herself before saying the last word. Though everyone in the surrounding rows had already heard the shape of the sentence and understood exactly what word she hadn't said. The red light on a phone in row 2 blinked on. Then another 1 row back. Damien Cole stood in the aisle of his own first-class cabin, his boarding pass in his hand, his seat occupied by a bag, and he felt the familiar weight of it. Not the indignity of this specific moment, but the accumulated weight of every room he had ever walked into, where someone had already decided before he opened his mouth, before he sat down, before he had done anything at all, that his presence was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. He had felt this weight before. He knew how to carry it, and he knew with the quiet certainty of long experience that he was not moving. Andre pressed the call button on the galley wall with the particular controlled urgency of a crew member who has correctly identified that this situation has moved past the point where it can be resolved through polite repetition. And when Captain Douglas stepped out of the cockpit 40 seconds later, straightening his cap with the unhurried authority of a man who has flown through thunderstorms and mechanical failures, and the full spectrum of human drama that tends to concentrate itself in pressurized metal tubes, at 38,000 feet. The first-class cabin had the breathless stillness of a room where everyone has stopped pretending they aren't watching. Captain Douglas was in his late 50s, silver-haired with a kind of weathered patience in his face that comes from decades of being the last calm person in a series of uncalm situations, and he looked at seat 1, A, at the orange bag sitting there with its brass hardware gleaming at the woman in 1B with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and at the man standing in the aisle with a boarding pass and the kind of composure that you only develop after you've had a great deal of practice needing it, and he did not need the situation explained to him. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had the natural authority of someone accustomed to being the final word in the room. "That bag needs to come out of seat 1A. Move it to the overhead bin, please." Patricia turned toward him with an expression that shifted in real time and with remarkable speed from entitlement to victimhood. Her eyes becoming soft and wounded, her voice dropping half an octave into a register that was meant to suggest distress rather than aggression. And she told the captain that she had been harassed since she sat down, that the man in the aisle had been aggressive and threatening, that she had felt genuinely frightened, that she was a platinum member who flew this route 4 times monthly, and that she simply needed her bag in a place where the leather wouldn't be damaged, and surely the captain could understand that. Captain Douglas listened to all of this without changing his expression, and then he said, "You have 10 seconds to move that bag, or I will call law enforcement to the aircraft." What happened next revealed something essential about Patricia Weston, which is that she had almost never in her adult life been faced with a consequence that actually arrived, and the result was that she had no practiced response to one. So instead of complying, she threw the bag. Actually threw it, swung it off the seat and let it drop onto the aisle floor with a heavy, deliberate thud, and then stood up to her full height and announced that she hoped everyone was satisfied that she was being persecuted by petty tyrants, that her husband would have everyone's badges, and that the man currently standing beside her seat was a freeloader who had clearly gotten his ticket through some upgrade scheme because people like him didn't book first-class seats, they got bumped into them. People like him, said the businessman in row 3A, setting his newspaper all the way down on his tray table. I'd like someone to explain exactly what that means. No one explained it. The silence was explanation enough. In row 4, Noah had stopped drawing. He was watching Patricia with the wide, careful eyes of a child who is witnessing something they know is wrong and is trying to understand why the adults aren't stopping it faster. He picked up his pencil and began to draw instead. The Port Authority officers arrived at the jet bridge within 4 minutes of Captain Douglas's call, which in airport time is extremely fast and suggests a seriousness of situation that the officers confirmed the moment they stepped into the first-class cabin and assessed what they found, which was a woman standing in the aisle delivering a monologue about persecution to an audience of increasingly uncomfortable passengers, a orange bag on the floor, a very calm black man with a boarding pass, and a captain with the expression of someone who has made his decision and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up to it. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," the first officer said. "I am not going anywhere," Patricia announced, and sat down in seat 1B and buckled her seatbelt with the emphatic click of someone who believes that this gesture constitutes a legal defense. This is discrimination. I am being removed because I am a woman standing up to an aggressive man, and I want that on record. The officer didn't argue. He unbuckled her belt. Patricia grabbed the armrests. Things deteriorated rapidly after that, involving a degree of physical resistance that the officers had not anticipated from a woman in a cream pantsuit, culminating in the moment when Patricia's heel connected with an officer's shin in a way that was either a desperate accident or a very deliberate mistake. And the officer's voice went flat and professional and said, "Ma'am, you are under arrest." And the cabin watched in complete total silence as Patricia Caldwell was handcuffed and walked down the aisle, in a state of dishevelment that her platinum helmet hair was somehow still fighting against, screaming over her shoulder at Damien that he would regret this, that he didn't know who she was, that she would sue him, the airline, the officers, the gate, and possibly the building itself. Damien stepped back to give the crew room. He watched her go. The cabin broke into applause. Captain Douglas returned to the cockpit. Damien finally sat down in seat 1A. And then nothing happened for 10 minutes. And then nothing happened for 20. The engines didn't start. The ground crew outside Damien's window were moving with the particular hurried energy of people managing a developing problem. And Captain Douglas's voice, when it finally came through, the PA had shed the authority it usually carried, and sounded like a man delivering news he genuinely wished he didn't have to deliver. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very sorry to inform you that Flight 882 has been canceled." He paused. During the removal of the disruptive passenger, a security protocol was triggered regarding the checked baggage. Additionally, due to the delay caused by the altercation, our flight crew has exceeded their legal duty hours under FAA regulations. We are unable to continue. Everyone will need to deplane and return to the terminal for rebooking. The cabin erupted. Damien closed his eyes. London was 9 hours away. The contract was $300 million ahead. The investors were already at their hotel. In row 4, Noah was not looking at the ceiling or gripping his armrests or calculating missed connections like the adults around him were doing. He was looking at the back of Damien's head, which hadn't moved, hadn't dropped, hadn't expressed anything that looked like defeat, and he was adding something to the drawing in his sketchbook with careful, deliberate strokes. And when his grandmother leaned over to ask what he was drawing, Noah said very quietly, "The man who didn't move," and went back to his pencil. Terminal 4 received 300 displaced passengers of Flight 882, the way a pond receives a stone thrown with real force, which is to say, with a significant splash and a great deal of agitated rippling in all directions at once. And at the center of that splash was the customer service desk, which now had a line extending far enough back that the people at the end of it couldn't see the front, and somewhere in the middle of the churning chaos, someone was going to need to be blamed, because when 300 people have lost their flights and their meetings and their hotel reservations and their carefully assembled plans for the next 24 hours, the desire to locate a cause tends to override the desire to locate the truth. Damien had walked up the jet bridge with his briefcase and his back straight, and his face composed in the way he had trained himself to hold it in situations that wanted very badly to undo his composure, and he was making his way toward a quiet corner near the window, away from the main current of the crowd, when a man from business class materialized in front of him with the specific energy of someone who has been building toward a confrontation for the past 20 minutes and has finally found the appropriate target. "Nice going," the man said, and there was enough contempt packed into those 2 words to fill a considerably longer sentence. "If you'd just sat somewhere else, none of this would have happened. She was crazy, yeah, but you just had to have your seat, didn't you? Now 300 people are stranded." Damien looked at him. He didn't say anything because there was nothing to say to this that would improve the situation, and because the particular cruelty of this moment, not just this moment, but all the moments like it that had preceded it, stretching back across his entire adult life, was that it always came with this second act. The one where after the first indignity you were then blamed for having noticed it. A woman a few steps away muttered, "Couldn't he just have been the bigger man?" And someone else said, "Ego trip," in the tone of someone delivering a diagnosis, and Damien walked past all of it, past the glares and the muttering and the retrospective wisdom of people who had said nothing whatsoever when Patricia was making her own large, loud self the problem, and he found his corner by the window, and he stopped and he looked out at the tarmac and at the plane that was still attached to the jet bridge, and he let himself feel it quietly and privately in a way he allowed himself to do only in corners like this one. Because here is the thing about Damien Cole that the business profile in Forbes had touched on but not quite captured, which is that there had been other rooms before this terminal, other moments of standing in a space where someone had looked at him and seen not a person but a category. Not Damien Cole specifically, but the broader concept of someone who didn't belong and the discipline of responding to those moments with stillness rather than fury was not something that had come naturally, and was not something that came without cost. And if he stood in this corner for 2 minutes, looking at the tarmac before he made the calls he needed to make, he figured he had earned those 2 minutes. He took out his phone. 1 missed call from Rick Harmon, CEO of the airline. He pressed call back, and then because his mind worked the way it did, He began to remember something about Meridian Supply Company, and the name Robert Weston, and a deal that had not yet been announced to the public, and a very specific kind of understanding settled over him like a key turning in a lock. He straightened his tie and he began to work. Patricia Weston had been released with a desk appearance ticket and a court date and a state of physical dishevelment that was at odds with the intact, unshakable conviction that she had been wronged. And when she emerged into the terminal and found 300 stranded passengers milling around in various states of fury and dismay, she recognized opportunity with the instinct of someone who has spent a lifetime converting her grievances into social currency. She found a cluster of the angriest passengers near the customer service line and planted herself among them, and within 3 minutes she was holding court, her voice pitched at the precise frequency of someone who has been gravely mistreated and needs the room to know it, weaving a narrative in which she was a stressed older woman who had been bullied off a flight by an aggressive man with a grudge against her bag, and the airline had taken his side because she was a woman alone, and honestly, wasn't that just typical? And didn't everyone agree that the whole situation could have been so easily avoided if certain people had simply shown a bit of flexibility and common decency? Poor Chloe, who had been at the check-in desk since 5 in the morning and wanted nothing more than to process rebookings in peace, found Patricia at the front of the counter demanding a first-class suite on the next available flight, plus compensation for what Patricia described as significant psychological trauma. And Chloe was standing there with the expression of someone absorbing an unexpected weather event when Damien stepped up quietly beside Patricia and said without raising his voice, without any edge in it at all, "I think you're about to get what you asked for. Go ahead and call Robert." Patricia stared at him. Then she took out her phone, put it on speaker, and dialed her husband with the confidence of someone playing their highest card. The phone rang twice. Patricia. Robert Weston's voice came through the speaker, and it had none of the reassuring spousal warmth she was expecting, which should have been the first warning. It had instead the tight, controlled terror of a man who had just received an email that had fundamentally rearranged his understanding of his afternoon. "Are you at JFK? Are you Patricia? Are you bothering a man named Damien Cole?" The terminal went quiet around them. Patricia looked at Damien. He gave a small, unhurried wave. "Robert, how do you know his name?" she said, and her voice had lost something, not everything, not yet, but something, some of the certainty that had been holding the rest of it together. Because Robert said through the speaker, and he sounded like a man watching a wall fall toward him in very slow motion, "I just got an email from the CEO of the airline, Patricia. And he copied the chairman of the company that now owns my company, and that man is standing next to you." The crowd that had been Patricia's audience 30 seconds ago went very, very still. Noah, standing a few steps back with his grandmother's hand in his, looked down at the drawing in his sketchbook and then back up at Damien Cole, and he held the sketchbook a little tighter. The conversation with Rick Harmon had taken 11 minutes and had covered more ground than most meetings 3 times its length, because Damien Cole was the kind of man who had spent 20 years practicing the discipline of knowing exactly what he wanted to accomplish before he started talking. And what he wanted to accomplish right now was not revenge. Exactly. Though justice was certainly somewhere in the vicinity of it. What he wanted was for 300 people to get where they were going, and for the people responsible for today to understand at a level they would not easily forget precisely what they had set in motion. He explained the situation to Rick in the calm, organized way he explained complicated situations in boardrooms, which is to say, he gave Rick the facts and then gave him the path forward. And the path forward was this Activate Emergency Commercial Recovery Protocol. Authorize triple pay for the crew to return to the aircraft on a voluntary basis, and let Damien personally cover the cost differential, because this was not the airline's fault, and the crew should not be penalized for it. Rick said yes before Damien finished the sentence. The second part of what Damien asked for was an email, a specific, carefully worded email from Rick Harmon himself to Robert Weston at Meridian Supply, with Damien copied announcing that Patricia Weston had been issued a permanent lifetime ban from the airline effective immediately, and that Meridian's relationship with the airline would be under formal review pending the outcome of the incident. Rick said yes to that too. Damien walked back to the gate. Patricia was still at Chloe's counter, had apparently shifted from demanding a suite to demanding a manager, and Chloe had the look of a person who was surviving on sheer professional obligation. Damien said Chloe Rick Harmon just sent authorization to the station manager. Emergency Commercial Recovery Platinum Code. Flight 882 is back on in 45 minutes. Chloe looked at her screen. The authorization code appeared in real time. Her hands were shaking slightly as she picked up the microphone, but her voice was steady, and when she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, due to the generosity of Mr. Damien Cole, Flight 882 has been reinstated boarding in 45 minutes. The terminal produced a sound that is hard to describe, except to say that it was the sound of 300 people exhaling at the same time, followed almost immediately by applause that built from scattered to sustained to genuinely thunderous. People clapped Damien on the back. A woman cried with relief and pressed her hands together in a gesture that wasn't quite a prayer, but was in the same neighborhood. The man who had confronted him near the window made his way over with the expression of someone who has arrived at the far end of a very bad decision and is ready to apologize for it. And he said haltingly, "Hey, I didn't know. I'm sorry." And Damien said, "It's fine. Don't block the aisle." And there was enough warmth in it that the man understood he was forgiven, and enough precision in it that he understood what he had done. Patricia stood at the edge of it all alone, in a way she hadn't been in a very long time, and no one was looking at her. This chapter needs to be written slowly, because it is the most important scene in the script, not because of what is said. Very little is said, but because of what it means and meaning. Unlike plot requires room to breathe. The gate had been reopened. Boarding passes were being rescanned, and Damien was standing slightly to one side of the general flow of passengers answering a text from his London team when he became aware of a small presence at his elbow with the particular quality of attention that only children have, which is to say completely focused and completely without agenda. And he looked down and found a 9-year-old boy standing there holding a sketchbook open to a page, looking up at him with the solemn expression of someone completing a task they have been thinking about for a while. "This is for you," Noah said. He held out the sketchbook. On the page, drawn in pencil, with the confident lines of a child who draws the way some children do, as naturally as breathing, was a figure. A tall man standing straight on what appeared to be the wing of a plane, or maybe the top of the world. It was hard to say, and beneath the figure in the careful capital letters of a child who has recently learned to make them reliably were the words, "The Man Who Stayed." Damien looked at the drawing for a long time. He had been in the Forbes 500. He had been on the cover of 2 national magazines. He had signed contracts worth more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. He had sat across tables from senators and generals and the heads of companies that moved the physical world, and he had done all of that without letting his face give away what he was feeling, because that discipline had been necessary and had served him well, and he was proud of it. But a 9-year-old boy with a pencil and a sketchbook had seen something in him today that none of the senators and generals had thought to mention, and the accuracy of it hit him somewhere below the level where composure lives. "What's your name?" Damien asked. "Noah." They shook hands. Noah was very serious about the handshake. Damien carefully tore the page from the sketchbook, folded it once, and placed it in the inner pocket of his suit jacket next to his passport. "Thank you, Noah," he said. "I mean that." Mrs. Ida Grant appeared at Noah's shoulder, took one look at the two of them, and said to Damien in the quiet, certain voice of a woman who has spent 32 years recognizing important moments when they happen, "He watched you all evening. Every minute of it. I thought you should know that someone saw you clearly." Damien didn't have a word for what he felt, but he nodded, and that was enough. The cabin of Flight 882 was dim and quiet at 38,000 feet over the Atlantic, the LED lighting set to the soft blue of a late evening. Most of the passengers finally relaxing into their seats after the extended drama of the departure, and Damien Cole was in seat 1. His seat, the correct seat. The seat whose right to occupy he had not given up, and he was not sleeping. He was looking out the window at the darkness that exists above clouds, which is one of the few places left in the world that has no Wi-Fi signal and no ambient noise and no claim on your attention. And he was thinking about the cost of the kind of day he'd had, not in terms of the contract or the delay or the 300 people who had very nearly missed their flights because of one woman's conviction that her comfort superseded their plans, but in terms of the quieter, more personal cost that doesn't show up in any Forbes profile and doesn't get mentioned in any boardroom. Andre appeared at his row and crouched down to speak at conversation height, the way good crew do when they want to have a real exchange rather than a transactional one. "I wanted to say thank you," Andre said. "The triple pay, it means a lot to all of us. But honestly, what meant more was watching you stand there and not." He paused, searching for the right word. "Not apologize for being in your seat." Damien turned from the window. "I shouldn't have to apologize for being in my seat." "No," Andre agreed. "You shouldn't. But most people in your position would have moved the bag themselves just to make it stop. And I've seen it. I've seen it so many times. People who have every right to stand there and they just..." He stopped. "They get tired," Damien said. "Yes, I get tired too," Damien said. "Being calm is not the same as not feeling it. I just decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to let somebody else's decision about where I belong become my decision about where I go." He paused. "That's all." 2 rows back, Noah was asleep in his seat, head leaned against his grandmother's shoulder, pencil still loosely curled in his hand, and outside the window the Atlantic rolled by unseen below them, dark and vast and indifferent to all of it. While Damien slept somewhere over the middle of the Atlantic with Noah's folded drawing against his chest, the world below was doing what the world does in the age of multi-angle video and algorithmic amplification, which is to say, it was catching fire. The young couple from row 2 had posted their footage first before the plane even pushed back, and it had the exact quality that the internet responds to with the velocity of a chemical reaction. Not produced, not edited, not performed, just a plain record of something true happening in a small space. And it showed in sequence: the bag, the request, Patricia's slow, contemptuous appraisal of Damien, and the 7 words that carried the whole weight of the afternoon in their casual delivery: "He looks like he's used to coach anyway." The businessman from row 3A had captured the arrival of the officers. A teenager who had been in the galley during the removal had caught Patricia's screaming exit in full, including the moment her heel met the officer's shin, including the handcuffs, including her shouted promise to sue everyone in the building. A TikTok account called @Travel Justice stitched all 3 clips together with the caption "CEO of entitlement versus the real CEO. Watch until the end for the instant karma." And the algorithm, which has a highly developed sensitivity to the specific combination of injustice and consequence, rocketed the video to the For You pages of 14 million people in the time it took Damien to fall asleep over the ocean. The comment section had the rare temporary quality of a place where everyone is on the same side. "Wait," I looked him up. "That's Damien Cole. He literally just bought the company her husband works for. This is some kind of 4-dimensional chess." She said "people like him" in a tone of voice that I think explains exactly what she meant by "people like him." Did she just kick a cop? She kicked a cop. "Ma'am, you just added a felony to your afternoon." The way he just stood there. "That man has spent a lifetime practicing how to be the calmest person in the room, and it shows." By the time the sun came up over the eastern seaboard, #BagLady was trending #1 in the United States and #3 in the United Kingdom. Meridian Supply Company's website had crashed, and Patricia Weston's name had been searched more times in 12 hours than in the entire preceding 5 decades of her life combined. Damien landed at Heathrow at 8 in the morning, feeling against all probability rested. He turned on his phone in the arrivals hall and stood still for a moment while it vibrated continuously for approximately 70 seconds, which is a long time for a phone to vibrate without stopping. He looked at the screen. He read the number of views on the video. He read the name of the lawsuit Patricia's lawyer had filed. He read the headline on the Daily Mail's website, "Air Rage Exclusive, Wife of Tech Exec, Kicks Cop Blocks Billionaire Seat, Gets Flight Cancelled. Internet Revolts." And there was a photo of Patricia screaming and a photo of him looking as though none of this was happening. His PR lead, Selena, picked up on the first ring and said, without preamble, "Don't talk to anyone at the gate. There are photographers. You're trending higher than the Prime Minister. The video has 40 million views, and Patricia Weston is currently on a morning show claiming you verbally abused her before the cameras started rolling." Damien walked through the sliding doors, was immediately surrounded by camera flashes, was flanked by his security team, got into the back of the waiting car and said, "Get me Catherine Ross. Get me Rick Harmon. And get me every second of JFK security footage from 6 p.m. last night." The car pulled into London traffic. "She wants a war," Damien said, looking out the window at the gray morning. "She thinks this is about reputation management." He straightened his cuffs. "It's about truth." Patricia Weston had been awake since her release from custody at 2 in the morning, had applied enough makeup to cover the evidence of the last 12 hours, and was sitting in her Greenwich living room with a laptop and a Zoom link, and the absolute conviction that her side of the story was the one that needed to be heard while her husband Robert paced the kitchen behind her in the focused, repetitive way of a man attempting to pace his anxiety out through the soles of his shoes. "Patricia, please," Robert said for the 4th time. "My boss's boss just put me on administrative leave. If you go on television and say anything that I am the victim here—" "Robert," Patricia said, smoothing her collar, and "I am going to say so." Robert stopped pacing. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent a certain number of years understanding that there are arguments that cannot be won, and he said, "My lawyer called. Damien Cole acquired the holding company that owns Meridian 3 weeks ago. He is technically the owner of my employer's parent company. Do you understand what that means?" And Patricia said, "It means he has a lot of power that he shouldn't have been allowed to abuse." And Robert walked out of the room. The Zoom screen opened. Patricia composed her face into the specific arrangement of a wronged woman, maintaining her dignity under pressure, soft in the eyes, measured in the voice. And when the host Diane appeared on screen and introduced her as the woman at the center of the viral BagLady video, Patricia had approximately 3 seconds to register that the framing of that introduction was not going in the direction she had planned before Diane said, "Patricia, we have 3 separate videos, a body cam recording, and a statement from the airline. I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to some specific things." Patricia said the footage was misleading. She said the context was missing. She said Damien Cole had made aggressive comments to her before the cameras were turned on. She said the police had been rough with her and she had only been defending herself. She said the whole thing was a coordinated smear campaign funded by a billionaire who didn't like being challenged by a woman. Diane said, "We have the audio from the gate recording Patricia, and it includes you calling the flight attendant a glorified waiter and the police officer a minimum wage servant. Would you like to address those specific statements?" Patricia forgot briefly that she was on television, and her voice rose several registers, and she said, "That footage is out of context, and the whole thing is lies, and I am the one being persecuted here, and the comment section of the live stream, which had been building for the last several minutes, produced at that moment approximately 4,000 responses in the span of 30 seconds. During the commercial break in the silence of her living room, Patricia looked at her own laptop screen where the clip of her on the plane had been auto-cued by the browser, and she heard herself say in her own voice with her own inflection, "He looks like he's used to coach anyway." She had not heard it played back before. She had heard it from the inside where it had felt like a reasonable observation about the natural order of things. But from the outside in the flat, unadorned recording of a cabin microphone, it sounded different. It sounded like something she might have heard someone else say and winced at. She sat with that for a moment, a long, uncomfortable moment before the commercial break ended, and the camera came back on, and she had not resolved it, but it was there, lodged somewhere she could not immediately reach, and it stayed there. Damien's London headquarters occupied the 14th floor of a glass building in Canary Wharf, and the conference room that looked out over the Thames had a table long enough that you could conduct a small diplomatic summit at one end without being heard at the other, and on the morning after Flight 882, with Patricia's muted television appearance running on the screen in the corner, it was full of people who had either flown through the night or connected via video link, and all of them were waiting to hear what Damien Cole intended to do. Rick Harmon was on the screen from New York, looking like a man who had been awake for most of the past 18 hours. Alaric Webb, the chairman of Meridian Supply, was physically present, which Damien had requested, and which Alaric had agreed to with the speed of someone who understood that his presence was not optional. Catherine Ross, the attorney, sat to Damien's left with a folder that was thicker than it had been the previous evening. Selena was at the end of the table monitoring 4 different social media feeds simultaneously on a laptop that was working very hard. Damien sat at the head of the table, and he looked the same as he had in seat 1. A composed, precise, unhurried, except that there was a quality to his attention in this room that made it clear he was not simply managing a situation, but had already resolved it and was now implementing the resolution. "Let me tell you what we found this morning," he said, and opened the folder that Catherine slid toward him. His team had spent the overnight hours conducting an audit of Robert Weston's Meridian expense accounts, and what they had found was that the Birkin bag, the $4,000 orange bag that had started all of this, had been purchased on a Meridian corporate card under the category of client relations, as had 3 other first-class tickets. In the past 18 months, a spa weekend in Palm Beach, and what appeared to be a significant number of meals at restaurants that Robert Weston would not have attended alone. "That's embezzlement," Alaric Webb said quietly, the color not quite leaving his face, but redistributing itself. "It is," Damien agreed, "and it's fraud, and we'll be reporting it. But before we get to the legal process, I want to address the 3 decisions that need to be made today." The decisions, as Damien laid them out, were these: Meridian would issue a public statement that day confirming Robert Weston's termination for cause, specifically for misappropriation of company funds, and conduct incompatible with the company's stated values, and Robert's unvested stock and pension entitlements would be revoked in accordance with the morality clause in his employment contract. The airline would file a civil suit against Patricia Weston for the documented costs of the cancellation, which Catherine had calculated at just over $400,000, including the crew, triple pay the fuel, the rebooking fees, and the administrative costs, and that suit would be filed for $500,000 with a lien placed against the primary residence in Greenwich to ensure the possibility of recovery, and the complete unedited security footage from JFK Terminal 4, including the section at the gate counter, including the encounter with Chloe, including the moment Patricia called the officers. Minimum wage servants would be released in full to the press without commentary. Selena looked up from her laptop. "If we release all of it, she won't recover from it. Her life, as she knows it, is over." The room was quiet. Damien looked at the television in the corner where Patricia was mid-sentence in a morning show interview, her hands gesticulating with the energy of someone fighting very hard to control a story that had already gotten away from her. He watched her for a moment. "I didn't do this to her," he said. I asked her to move a bag. Everything after that was her decision. He closed the folder. I'm not turning off the lights, I'm just not turning them back off for her. He looked around the room. Are we clear on the 3 items everyone in the room confirmed that they were clear? 6 weeks after Flight 882, the airline's board of directors convened an extraordinary session that had not been on anyone's calendar at the beginning of the year, and the agenda item that had placed it there was listed simply as Crew Protection Review, which was the kind of institutional understatement that covers a genuine reckoning the way a light coat covers winter. Damian Cole was in the room, but he was not at the head of the table. He was seated along the side in the row of chairs reserved for invited observers, and he had specifically requested this arrangement because the thing he wanted to happen in this room was not something that needed his voice at the front of it, it needed someone else's. Andre Beaumont had been a flight purser for 19 years, and he had never before been invited to speak at a board meeting of the airline that employed him, and he stood at the front of the room with no notes because the things he wanted to say were not the kind of things you need notes for. He talked about the 19 years. He talked about the incidents he had witnessed that had never been reported because the reporting mechanism was unclear and the outcome uncertain, and the risk of being seen as a troublemaker was more concrete than the possibility of anything changing. He talked about the specific grinding exhaustion of being required to remain professional in situations where the person you were required to remain professional toward was treating you as though your job title was an insult. He talked about the gap between what the training manual said crew members should do and the actual authority those crew members had when the moment arrived, which was a gap you could park a 777 in. A board member interrupted him at one point to note that the airline had invested significantly in diversity and inclusion programming over the past several years, and Andre paused and then said with the precision of a man who has thought carefully about how to say this, "Training that isn't backed by real authority is just rehearsal for a show that never gets performed." I know what the training says. I've done the training. The training did not give me the power to protect the passengers in my cabin. Policy does, and the policy wasn't there. The room was quiet after that in the way rooms get quiet when something true has been said that is also inconvenient. The board voted that afternoon to establish the Crew Protection Protocol, a new operating procedure that gave cabin crew explicit documented authority to refuse service to passengers who had engaged in harassment or discriminatory conduct, provided them with immediate access to legal and HR support in the event of any resulting complaint, and created a direct reporting channel that bypassed the middle layers of management that had historically made reporting feel more dangerous than silence. It was not a perfect document. No policy created in an afternoon is a perfect document. But it was a real one with teeth and with the weight of the board behind it, and when it was signed, Damian stood from his observer's chair and crossed the room and shook Andre's hand, and Andre said, "You didn't have to be here today." And Damian said, "You were in that cabin when I needed someone to stand behind what was right. The least I could do was show up." The conference room of Catherine Ross's Manhattan law firm 3 months after Flight 882 had all the warmth of a very expensive freezer, which may have been an architectural choice, or may have been a reflection of the weather outside which was sending December snow against the windows in the particular way of a city that commits fully to its winters. Patricia Weston sat on one side of the mahogany table and looked like someone who had been through a sustained process of subtraction. The platinum helmet hair was gone, replaced by a simple graying ponytail. The designer suit was gone. The practiced poise was mostly gone, replaced by the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent 3 months fighting a war on multiple fronts and has recently begun to understand that they are losing all of them. Victor Crest, her attorney, sat beside her with the expression of a man who had taken this case on a contingency basis and had since developed some complicated feelings about that decision. Damian Cole sat directly across from her, and he was still somehow inexplicably given everything exactly the same as he had been in Seat 1A on the night of July 14th. Same composure, same stillness, same absolute refusal to perform discomfort for an audience. Catherine Ross had a binder. She always had a binder. The binder was very thick. Mrs. Weston. Catherine began, "You are suing Mr. Cole for defamation, emotional distress, and damage to your reputation. You claim his actions caused you to lose your social standing and your quality of life. Is that accurate?" "He ruined me," Patricia said. Her voice had the flatness of someone who has said this many times and is no longer saying it for effect. "I can't go anywhere without people recognizing me. My friends won't return my calls. My husband left. I've lost everything." She was not wrong about the facts. She had lost the house in Greenwich when the settlement liens were processed. The Aspen apartment was gone. Robert had filed for divorce in August and had relocated to Florida with minimal communication, and a lawyer who had successfully argued that Patricia's public misconduct constituted a violation of the morality clause in their prenuptial agreement's alimony provisions. She was living in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens and working as a data entry clerk for a medical billing company whose manager did not follow celebrity news. Catherine laid Exhibit A on the table, the audio transcript from the cabin. She walked Patricia through it, the comments to Andre, the instructions to find Damien another seat, the 7 words. Patricia's responses ranged from, "I don't remember saying that," to, "It was out of context," to, "I was under significant stress," and each response was met with a corresponding exhibit from Catherine's binder, and the binder, it became clear, was going to outlast Patricia's defenses. Damien let it proceed for 20 minutes before he spoke. When he did, it was quietly and directly the way he said everything. "Mrs. Weston, you have said several times today that I ruined your life. I want to address that." He paused. "I asked you to move a bag. That's the entirety of my contribution to this situation. Every decision after that was yours." Patricia looked at him across the table, and something in her face shifted. Not a collapse, not a dramatic moment of remorse, but something smaller and more real. The kind of shift that happens when a person has been carrying a version of events for long enough that they've stopped questioning it, and then suddenly in a room like this one, the version loses its structural support. "I heard that recording," she said, and her voice was different from the one she had used all afternoon, lower, less defended. "The recording from the cabin, the 7 words." She stopped. I heard myself say it the way someone else would have heard it. And she stopped again. It wasn't what I thought I'd said. The room was very quiet. "That's the first honest thing you've said today," Damien said. "Not unkindly, not as an attack, just as an observation. And it's something. It genuinely is something." He stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked at Victor Crest. "You have 24 hours to withdraw the lawsuit and accept our counter-settlement terms. If we go to trial, I will put every frame of that footage on a screen in the courtroom, and I will let 12 ordinary people decide who the victim was." He picked up his briefcase. "I'm not doing this because I want to take the rest of what you have," he said to Patricia without particular harshness. "I'm doing it because the people who were in that cabin, the crew, the gate agents, the 300 passengers, the 9-year-old boy who drew a picture of a man standing straight while everyone around him was screaming, all of them deserve to know that this mattered. That standing still when someone tells you to move mattered." He walked to the door. "I hope you figure out who you want to be on the other side of this," he said, and opened it and left. The statement from Meridian Supply Company was brief, corporate in tone, and absolutely devastating in content, running to 4 sentences that announced Robert Weston's termination for cause, cited misappropriation of company funds as the stated reason, confirmed the revocation of unvested equity and pension benefits, and concluded with a line about the company's commitment to standards of conduct that, in the context of everything preceding it, read like a door being firmly shut. It was published on a Tuesday morning and retweeted 40,000 times before lunch, largely because the comment section of the TikTok video had weeks earlier compiled and shared Robert Weston's LinkedIn profile and the internet had already done the math on who he was relative to who Damian Cole was, and the statement landing on top of that existing understanding had the quality of a last chapter that everyone had known was coming, but was still satisfying to read. Robert had called a lawyer the same evening the email from Rick Harmon arrived. The divorce filing came 2 weeks later. He had moved to Florida, not dramatically, and not with a great deal of announcement, but with the quiet efficiency of a man executing a plan he had been building toward for some time, and the settlement terms which Patricia had initially fought and eventually accepted because she had run out of resources and options with which to fight, gave her the furniture and the credit card debt and the legal obligations, and gave Robert a clean separation that he had apparently been considering long before the flight to London. His last real conversation with Patricia had been a phone call in September, 3 weeks after the filing, and he had said only one thing that she remembered afterward, which was not a threat or a recrimination, but a genuine question delivered in a tone she had rarely heard from him, which was the tone of honest bewilderment. "Did you ever think even once about how it felt to be the other people in these situations? Not strategically, not in terms of what they could do to you, just how it felt to be them." Patricia had not had an answer to that question in September. She was still thinking about it. The house in Greenwich, the one with the rose garden that Patricia had planted herself and the kitchen she had renovated twice in 12 years, sold in November, 2 months after the liens were placed and the proceeds went directly to the settlement accounts, and Patricia stood in the empty living room on the morning of the closing and looked at the walls, which had the particular blank quality of walls that have recently had pictures removed. And she thought about the question Robert had asked, and she thought about the recording she had heard of her own voice, and she thought about a man in a charcoal suit who had held a boarding pass in his hand and asked for nothing more than the seat he had paid for, and for the first time since July she did not reach immediately for the version of events in which she was the protagonist of a persecution. She reached instead for her coat, and she closed the door behind her, and she did not look back. LaGuardia Airport in November has a specific quality of unglamour that is hard to replicate in other settings. The orange plastic seats bolted to the floor, the overhead lights that deliver illumination without warmth, the particular blend of Auntie Anne's pretzels and stale coffee, and the concentrated human energy of people who are going somewhere but would rather already be there. And Patricia Weston moved through it as she moved through everything now, which was quietly without the force field of assumed importance that had once preceded her into every room. She was wearing jeans and a beige jacket from a mid-range retailer. Her hair had grown out from the platinum to its natural color, which was a graying brown that she had spent 30 years covering and had recently decided to stop fighting. She had a single carry-on duffel bag, canvas bought second-hand, and she was looking for the departure board for the $89 non-refundable flight to Fort Lauderdale that represented her current understanding of what a vacation could mean, which was not a suite and a driver and a restaurant reservation, but a few days in a smaller city where no one knew her face. The Queen's apartment was functional. The data entry job was steady. She had started seeing a therapist in October, not because she had arrived at the decision gracefully, but because her therapist had been recommended by the court as a condition of the deferred prosecution agreement on the assault charge, and then she had continued going after the requirement ended because she had found somewhat against her expectations that having someone ask her honest questions about herself was not entirely without value. She had not yet figured out who she was without the things that used to tell her. That process was ongoing. She found a seat near her gate and took out her phone to check the boarding time, and the news app that she had stopped following obsessively but had not deleted surfaced an article with a notification she hadn't requested. The way news apps sometimes do when an algorithm has decided you have a relevant interest. Cole Global, CEO launches Crew Shield Initiative, $5 million, commitment to airline worker protection. She should have swiped it away. Instead, she clicked it. There was a photograph of Damian Cole standing on a stage at a gala event, and next to him, also on the stage, holding a small award and looking like a man who had not expected to be holding an award, and was not entirely sure what to do with his face was Andre Beaumont, the purser from Flight 882, and the caption identified him as the initiative's first honoree. Patricia read the article. The Crew Shield initiative would provide immediate legal support for airline workers who faced harassment or assault from passengers, a fund to cover medical and psychological costs, and an advocacy arm that would push for formal recognition of crew safety as a regulatory priority rather than an internal HR matter. $5 million from Damien Cole's personal funds. At the bottom of the article, in the last paragraph, almost as a footnote, was this: a unique item was auctioned at the gala to launch the fundraising, a slightly used orange Hermes Birkin bag acquired through a bankruptcy asset liquidation. The bag sold for $45,000. The winning bidder, who asked to remain anonymous, reportedly intends to use it as a gym bag. Patricia stared at her phone until the screen dimmed. She thought about the bag. She thought about how certain she had been holding it that it represented something essential about who she was and what she was owed by the world. She thought about the expression on Andre's face in the photograph. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just quietly, pleased, the expression of a man who has done his job well for a long time and been seen doing it. And she thought about every person she had treated the way she had treated Andre, as though the uniform they wore was a description of their worth rather than simply a description of their job. The boarding announcement came over the intercom. Group C. Patricia stood up, shouldered her duffel bag, and joined the line. When the gate agent scanned her ticket and said with the automatic warmth of someone 3 hours into an 8-hour shift, "Have a good flight." Patricia looked at her. Actually looked at her, at the specific tired human face beneath the airline logo lanyard, and said, "Thank you. You too. I mean it." The gate agent blinked slightly, surprised, and said, "That's really kind of you." It wasn't much, but it was real. And real Patricia was beginning to understand was the only currency that didn't eventually get repossessed. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, addressed in the careful, oversized capital letters of a child who has recently gained confidence in the alphabet and wants every letter to know it, and it was addressed to Damien Cole. Cole Global Logistics, and the return address, in the upper left corner, had Noah's name above a street address in Philadelphia, and the woman who handled Damien's mail had placed it at the top of the stack, because in her experience, envelopes that arrived in handwriting like this were always worth Damien's direct attention. He opened it at his desk late in the afternoon, when the London light was going golden through the windows, and inside was a single sheet of paper that had clearly been torn from a sketchbook with the slightly ragged left edge that you get when you pull a page cleanly but carefully from a spiral binding. It was a drawing, and it was a continuation. The first drawing, the one Noah had handed him at the gate, the man standing straight with the words, "The man who stayed," was now in a simple wooden frame on Damien's desk, the paper protected under glass, one of very few personal objects in an office that was otherwise decorated in the standard vocabulary of corporate success. The new drawing picked up where the first one left off. In it, the tall man was still standing in his original position, and beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, was a smaller figure, a child, and both of them were looking in the same direction toward something outside the frame that the drawing didn't show, but that felt from the composition like something worth looking toward. Beneath the figures in Noah's careful capitals was this: "Grandma Ida says you are the man who stayed. I want to grow up and stay too." Damien sat at his desk with the drawing in both hands and said nothing because there was nothing to say, and because sometimes the right response to something that lands directly in the middle of you is not to speak, but to feel it clearly without deflection, without the composure that is useful in boardrooms, but is not always useful in the quiet moments when something true finds you. He placed the new drawing beside the first one and reached for his phone and asked his assistant to connect him with the legal team working on the Cole Foundation, which had been in the preliminary planning stages for several months, and he said he wanted to move forward with the STEM scholarship program, and he wanted the first cohort to include 20 students from underrepresented communities in the Philadelphia area, and he wanted the program to be announced before the end of the month. He put the phone down. He looked at the two drawings on his desk, the man standing alone and then the man with the child beside him, both of them looking toward the same unseen thing, and he thought about a 9-year-old boy with a pencil who had watched him for an entire evening and seen in all that watching nothing more complicated and nothing less important than a person who had decided not to leave. That was the thing no one had written about him. That was the thing that didn't appear in the Forbes profile. That was the thing that mattered most. A year later, 11 months and 22 days to be precise, though. Damien was not counting. He was on a flight to London again, and he was in seat 1A again, and there was no drama in it. This time, no bag, no confrontation, no cascade of consequences, just the ordinary miracle of being exactly where you are supposed to be, which is a thing that people who have never had to fight for their place tend to take entirely for granted, and which Damien had never in 45 years been able to take for granted, and had long ago decided he wasn't going to resent that because resentment was a weight he couldn't afford and a destination he didn't want to arrive at. The cabin was quiet and dim, the blue LED lighting set to evening, and outside the window the late sun was turning the clouds below into something that looked like a landscape from a place that doesn't exist, all orange and violet and the particular shade of gold that belongs exclusively to high altitude. Andre appeared at his row. He set a glass of sparkling water on the tray table, made eye contact, gave a single nod that contained about 3 sentences worth of acknowledgement, and moved on without a word. Because some things between people have been said thoroughly enough that they don't need to be said again. Damien took out his phone. The lock screen was the photograph he had taken of Noah's first drawing, the tall figure, the careful capitals, the man who stayed. And he looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you have made your North Star. Not because it tells you where to go, but because it reminds you of who you decided to be when the decision was hard. He put the phone back in his pocket. He looked out the window at the Atlantic 38,000 feet below, at the impossible distance between the water and where he was sitting, at the thin membrane of the window between the pressurized warm air of the cabin and the absolute cold of the upper atmosphere. And he thought about what it cost to be the kind of person who stays, and whether the cost was worth it, and arrived at the same answer he always arrived at. It was worth it because Noah was watching. Not just Noah specifically, though Noah specifically was now enrolled in the Cole STEM Scholar program and was apparently demonstrating a particular gift for structural drawing that his teacher had described in the program's quarterly update as architectural in its precision, which Damien thought was exactly right. But all the Noahs, all the children watching adults to learn what adults do when someone tells them to move. All the children learning from every room where they sit quietly with a pencil and observe what it looks like when a person decides that where they belong is not a question that belongs to anyone else. He was tired. He closed his eyes. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. 18 months after the night a bright orange bag sat in seat 1A and a woman with platinum hair decided a black man in a charcoal suit had no business being in first class. The Crew Shield initiative was operating across 14 airlines in 4 countries and at an aviation safety conference in Geneva. Andre Beaumont became the first working flight attendant, not an executive, not a union head, not a spokesperson to deliver a keynote address to an international industry body. He opened by telling the story of the bag. He did not name Patricia. He named Damien with permission, and when he described the moment the 9-year-old boy handed the drawing to the man in the aisle, there was not a sound in a room that held 400 aviation professionals. And then there was quite a lot of sound, and it was the kind of sound that means something has landed in a place where it will stay. Patricia Weston did not fly first class anymore. She did not fly much at all, partly because of finances, and partly because airports were still a year and a half later, places where people sometimes recognized her face and made their recognition known, and she had developed a preference for driving when the distance permitted it. She was still in therapy. She had not fully figured out who she was, but she had stopped lying to herself about who she had been, and she was discovering that this, though it was not pleasant and though it arrived too late for several things she could not recover, was its own kind of foundation. Noah, age 10, submitted his first architectural drawing to the Cole Foundation's Young Designers competition and was awarded first place in his age category. The drawing was of an airplane. He titled it in careful capitals, "The Place Where Everyone Has a Seat." If this story moved, you hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story about what happens when dignity refuses to move and justice refuses to look away.